the Irish wooden flute is really just a flute the way they were in the 1800s. This is a replica of a flute from around 1825. It's a beautiful instrument made out of cocos wood by Patrick Allwell, a famous flute builder. It does have a few keys on it that make it fully chromatic, but I don't really use them, hardly ever. In fact, I turn this one key away so it won't get in my way, because I'm just going to use the holes. And that's because the Irish ornaments need the holes, like I was saying. For example, you have the cut. That's where you just cut the sound. It's a quick little cut. It's supposed to just sound like a blip. And then you have something called a tip. That's also just a percussive effect. You put them all together, you get a roll, which is principal note, cut, principal note, tip, and principal note. Kind of like a classical turn. But instead of hearing the tones, you actually just hear it as a percussive effect. Almost like a drum roll. So that's a typical Irish ornament. Here's a tune that uses a lot of rolls, so you can hear what they sound like. It's called the Legacy Jig. I did something called finger vibrato, because in Irish music we don't use a regular classical vibrato like this. That's classical music. We use finger vibrato, or no vibrato at all, just straight. So that was a jig. Jigs are in 6/8. Now reels are in 4/4. This is a reel called Old Rainy Day. So that's a reel in 4/4. We also have multi-part jigs. I'll play my whistle to show you that. For you, a multi-part jig. So it's still in 6/8, but it's got, this is a 4-part jig called Langstrom Pony. And you can hear what the D whistle sounds like. feel like kicking up your heels and dancing?
Hi, my name is Ruth, and I am a member of the bassoon section of the Los Angeles Symphonic Winds, and this, of course, is the bassoon. The bassoon is the lowest woodwind instrument in your standard instrumentation for band or wind ensemble, and it is a double reed, and it has a range of about 3.5 octaves. So it goes from low B flat below the bass clef staff all the way up to, if you're really, really good, you can get all the way up to a high F above the treble clef. I don't get up that far. So the bassoon has a very interesting history, and we're going to talk a little bit about this instrument today and get to know it a little better. What we know as the modern reeded woodwind instruments started popping up in the Middle Ages in Renaissance music, and they were known as shawms. They were these cylindrical long instruments, and you played them with either a single reed or a double reed. And as Renaissance music progressed and it evolved a little bit, the available range needed had to expand. So instrument makers started making very low woodwind instruments that were extremely large. So as you can see from that picture, shawms started getting very large, and they had bells that would extend 9 or 10 feet in the air. So they didn't have a lot of agility or a ton of utility, really. So instrument makers started experimenting with folding the instrument, like brass instruments where that long piece of tubing gets folded and you get a nice compact shape. Instrument makers started putting U's at the bottoms of these large shawms so that they folded, and that became known as the dulcian. The dulcian originally came in a variety of tunings, and it was used to double the bass line in different musical ensembles. These instruments started to gain a lot of popularity during the Reformation when organ music was banned, and they needed more versatile instruments to double that bass line. As the Renaissance period gave way to the Baroque period in music, the first modern-like bassoon was also developed in the mid-17th century. It had some very clear improvements. It came apart in 4 sections, like you see on the modern bassoon, and we'll talk about in a little bit. And it also could play a full step lower than the dulcian. So it could be featured prominently in Baroque music because it had more versatility. However, these instruments were very minimal. They only had 3 keys in addition to the tone holes, and they had some issues like they lacked chromaticism. Throughout the 18th century, as the Baroque era in music transitioned into the classical era, instrument makers wanted to continue to increase the utility of this instrument. So to deal with that issue of chromaticism, they started to experiment by adding different keys to the instrument. This gave the instrument some increased chromaticism and a lot of increased flexibility throughout the classical era. In the 19th century, as the classical period in music gave way to the Romantic period, Buffet and Heckel, two big names still in instrument manufacturing, decided that they were going to develop their own variation on the bassoon. These two systems that they developed, Buffet the French system and Heckel the German system, are systems that still persist today, and most modern bassoons, like what I'm holding here, are based on the German Heckel system. So let's go ahead and take this thing apart and show you a little bit about the mechanics of the bassoon. So this is the modern bassoon, and like that mid-17th century bassoon, it has 4 basic parts. So you have what is known as the boot joint, and this is the joint that bends. So if you take off the cap, you have what is called the U-joint, and that connects the 2 holes. So it makes one U-shaped tube. The second piece you have, this is known as the wing joint. And then you have, this is the long joint. And this is the bell. So in the 18th century, when instrument makers were experimenting with keys, the bassoon, very uniquely, has a lot of thumb keys. This instrument has 13. And the final part of the bassoon is the bocal. And that goes at the top of the wing joint. So that, in a nutshell, is the bassoon. Thank you for joining me today and allowing me to tell you a little bit more about this instrument that I really love to play.
Hi, I'm Claudia Peterson. I'm one of the tenor saxophonists with the LA Symphonic Winds, and I'll be talking about and demonstrating saxophone for you today. So what I have is a tenor, which is in the middle of the range of saxophones. There's 4 basic types, most common anyway, soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone. There's other types of saxophones, but those are the 4 most common ones. The other ones are pretty specialized, so you don't see them super often, and we're actually kind of like experiments from when the saxophone was invented, so a little bit of history. The saxophone was invented in the 1840s by a Belgian man named Adolphe Sax. And so part of his aim with inventing the saxophone was to create an instrument that combined properties of both woodwind instruments and brass instruments. The saxophone is technically a woodwind, despite being made out of metal, because it uses a reed as the main thing to create its sound. The reason why it was made out of metal, though, is because that's a way more resonant material. So it has a much louder sound than other actually woodwinds do. So it's also probably one of the easier woodwind instruments to learn how to play, because it was, kind of a little bit more engineered. Because the embouchure is really easy, which is the way that you hold your mouth on the instrument to make the noise out of the mouthpiece. But then also the fingerings are really pretty easy because they're all kind of, pretty much like in order. And then, and this is not true for a lot of other instruments, is that between octave ranges, the fingerings are different, but that is the same on the saxophone, because one of the keys is there's this thumb octave key, which makes it pretty easy to switch between octaves. So it is a pretty easy instrument to learn. I have a lot of bias in that, though, because when I was in 5th grade starting out in band instruments, I was offered the choice to try out a few instruments, and the saxophone was the one that I made noise out of, which is kind of how I ended up doing that, because I had tried like the flute and some other things. I wanted to play percussion, but I didn't have enough experience playing the piano, which was one of the prerequisites. A quick rundown of saxophone anatomy. So this is the mouthpiece, holds the reed, which is a carved piece of wood. That is the thing that vibrates to generate the sound. So the mouthpiece connects to the neck. This portion is the neck, which is a separate piece, comes off for easy storage. The rest of this is generally the body, although this is the bell of the saxophone, where at its lowest notes, this is where the sound comes out. But another thing about woodwinds is that they're, unlike brass instruments, they're not directional. So because all of the keys correspond to openings, so all the sound comes out all over the place on the instrument, depending on which keys you're pushing. So that said, there is, fingerings correspond to a note, and there is a pretty finite range, at least on the low end of the saxophone, because there's only so many keys you can push down to create a longer column of air, as it were, which is how you get the low notes. So you only have so many buttons you can push before you get like these being the last things that you can push down before you run out of saxophone, basically.